In the past, important cultural traditions and information were handed down orally from generation to generation. In modern times, this has been done through novels and movies and what is rightly referred to as television programming. Last year, we did a video called "Does Society Know It's Being Initiated?" And since then, pretty much everything we said in that video about the level society is at, being inundated with what was once referred to as occult themes, has only skyrocketed to a cartoonish level of almost cliche absurdity. Again, occult means hidden, but this stuff isn't even really occult anymore because it isn't hidden. It's blatantly being shoved in everyone's face. Now we live in a society that's completely awash in what was once occult symbolism, but nothing's been so overt as the new Ari Aster film Midsommar, which doesn't even come across as a film so much as a mile marker on the road that society is currently headed down toward the destination awaiting us in whatever the next phase is after postmodern.
This review might seem kind of out of the blue, but we review lots of movies, mainly behind the scenes. We just don't get a chance to talk about them and put stuff up about them on the channel. But this film seems a little different. It's extremely in your face with a lot of occultic information, a blatant display of rituals, and a very particular attitude about the decline of society and the rise of really ancient systems that seem to be making a comeback. The film Midsommar unleashes a transformative horror film about a cult society who live and die by annual rituals that control the destiny of their lives. Sacrifice is the unexpectedly seductive answer that Dani finds to ending her suffering, to breaking up with a bad relationship, and sharing her burdens collectively with a community that revels in the pain of emotion and the joys and benefits of being part of a murderous Luciferian death cult. It's a society that's so sick, it'll leave you wondering, wait, is our own society even sicker?
As all of these pagan and occult belief systems are being promoted and pushed more and more on society, they're getting more and more blatant to the point that we're being taken well past just the cutesy Harry Potter version of it that's been pushed on every middle school age child the world over to a much, much darker realm of it. But it's being promoted as if this is society's answer to everything. It's the answer to all of society's ills, as if we just come together harmoniously as one human hive under these quote-unquote natural, nature-centric belief systems. And the movies that are coming out make no apologies for the horrible violence that are in them, because that's just a part of the natural cycle that we're all supposed to just accept. So while this is being mainstreamed, they also want to condition everyone and dehumanize everyone to accept these things, which I don't think any of us really should.
How do people not recognize this is going on? Well, this is one of those movies that puts it in your face and calls attention to it and kind of sends a wake-up call like this is happening and you should analyze what's going on.
Ari Aster was the director of Hereditary, and he was actually approached and asked to make this film. Everything in this film is purposeful, from the art, which tells the story of what's going to happen in the film before it does, to what he admitted was the occult use of runes throughout the film. In fact, in an interview, Astor told The Ringer that he even created what he refers to as an effect language or an emotional language akin to singing in tongues specifically for this film, and that the costumes, which are also covered in runes specific to each character, were designed especially so that he could imbue them with extra meaning using symbols. In other words, this movie was taken to a Stanley Kubrick level of detail. So the basic plot of Midsommar is that a group of friends go to the middle of nowhere rural Sweden to attend a traditional folk festival. We open in the dead of winter on Dani Arter, who is anxious and upset because her bipolar sister has sent her a worrisome email and won't answer any of Dani's phone calls. Holding back her anxiety in tears, she calls her boyfriend Christian Hughes, who's hanging with his friends that all seem to think Dani sucks and is mentally unstable, and therefore he should just dump her instead of putting up with her. When she gets off the phone with him, she calls her friend with a new worry on top of everything else that she's too emotionally needy of her boyfriend, despite the fact that she could barely tell him how she felt in the first place, and he barely seemed to care anyway. While she runs to the cabinet to grab a decent dose of Ativan, a psychotropic medication that's commonly used to treat anxiety. And this is Astor's basic overview of our failing modern Western society. It's cold, it's pale, everyone's holding back their true feelings, and people's psychological issues are being downplayed and ridiculed, and only the symptoms are being dealt with via dangerous pharmaceutical drugs. Everyone is portrayed as generally emotionally disconnected, and in Dani's case, she's communicating with everyone through technology, which is failing her. Come to find out, her sister actually killed her parents and then herself by pumping carbon monoxide from the family's vehicles into the house. So now Dani's technologically disconnected, psychologically damaged family has been completely destroyed. And now that she's an orphan, she's properly whittled down to a base to be alchemically transformed and initiated into a new family. Dani's black and white checkered kitchen floor also calls up a familiar symbol of duality that the Freemasons employ in their temples. One of many references to the supposed sorcery that the union of opposing dualistic principles can bring about. Skip forward, and it's solstice time, and exchange student Pele has invited Dani, Christian, and their friends Mark and Josh over to his rural village, which he later refers to as the Land of the Midnight Sun, for what they are told is just a midsummer festival. Once they arrive, Astor lets the audience know right away that their worldview is about to get turned upside down Alice in Wonderland style by literally flipping the camera upside down as they drive down the road, which is a trick he also pulled in his occult symbolism-filled Rosemary's Baby themed movie Hereditary that came out last year. The first thing the group does when they get there is take hallucinogens, a prominent feature of mystery religions the world over. And this is the first time we see Dani able to even calm down. As she sits in a sunny field with her friends, she sees the grass growing through her hand, symbolizing the beginning of her reconnection with nature. This new setting is colorful and vibrant and sunny and bright, and everyone's wearing floral crowns and they're garbed in white, which is a stark contrast to the dark, dreary states and the gray and black shirts the newcomers seem to wear for the rest of the film, which make them stand out blatantly from everyone else. After this initial day of fasting and purification, the group hikes through the woods to the village of the Hargett cult. In order to enter, they must walk through a giant sun-shaped archway, the sun being a prominent deity and worshipped by the community. In a technique employed repeatedly throughout this film, Astor walks the camera through the archway in a first-person viewpoint, so the audience also symbolically walks through the sun with the rest of the group. Then everyone is greeted by a male Hargett member who tells them that his dress is meant to symbolize and venerate Hermaphrodite. The balance of male and female energies, also most recognizably symbolized in modern times in Baphomet, the hermaphroditic goat person venerated by many secret societies. The figure everyone is by now no doubt familiar with was drawn by occult magician Eliphas Levi in the 1850s to symbolize an equilibrium of opposites, which Levi himself claimed should result in a perfect social order. This balance of male and female energies is seen again and again in the rituals performed by the Hargett throughout this film, and despite their brutal ways, they are portrayed as living in a harmonious balance with both nature and each other. Just like Larry Harvey, co-creator of Burning Man, Astor admits he read and took inspiration from Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough when making this film. Midsommar portrays many rituals, all of which are based on reality. That's why I tweeted that only about 8% of this film is actually fiction. The film itself is an exoteric and esoteric education in occult rituals, screened on an international stage. The first major ritual is based on something called the Stupa, which I'm probably saying wrong. But two elderly members of the Harga, specifically one male and one female, again in harmonious balance, commit ritualistic suicide by jumping off of a cliff because they've reached the age of 72, the oldest anyone is allowed to get in this society. While modern historians have since claimed the Stupa is just a persistent myth in Sweden, writings about these synthesized cliffs date back to at least the 6th century AD. Following a feast at a rune-shaped table, a procession takes the couple up to the cliff where they cut their hands and smear their blood on a rune stone before jumping to their deaths. While bloodletting rituals are nothing new in our modern media and are actually turning into an overused trope as we've pointed out before, smearing blood on the runes is a practice carried out in runic magic supposedly to activate their force. As the two elderly people get ready to jump, on the ground, one of the Harga turns around in an otherwise pointless scene and stares directly into the camera, making eye contact with the audience. The intention here seems to be to let the audience know that they too are not only witness but part of this ritual with the rest of the group. And this isn't the only time this happens in this movie. Before the second big ritual, the maypole dance, Christian actually sits down and turns around and looks directly into the camera behind him, once again making direct eye contact with the audience and including them. Sacred circle dances are very old magical rites that have been practiced for thousands of years in cultures the world over, but the maypole dance can be traced back to a pagan phallic worship dance in honor of the fertility god and goddess. The pole itself symbolizes a phallus, and the wreaths on it symbolize the womb. Before the ceremony begins, they have everyone drink a hallucinogenic brew, which one of the Hargas says will open everyone up to what she calls, quote-unquote, the influences. Danny looks down and once again sees grass growing through her feet as her connection to nature through this process deepens. During the dance, she is spontaneously able to speak and understand Swedish all of a sudden. Which reminded me of something I read in an 1887 theosophical text, The Hidden Way Across the Threshold, where it's claimed that, according to the philosophy of the mystics, there are 12 spiritual senses that, if you open yourself up to spirits, which is technically what she's done by drinking whatever this is and opening herself up to the influences, it would enable someone to gain a more perfect knowledge of good and evil, which is a reference to the biblical fall. The 8th sense mentioned here is the ability to interpret various languages and to speak in them, which is the stage right before the 9th stage, which is basically what sounds to me like demon possession. Throughout the film, runes are placed everywhere on buildings and artwork and clothing, and these runes, if you look up what they mean, tend to spell out exactly what's happening in that scene or with that character, including the two main runes on Danny's dress during the maypole dance, which stand for death and illumination or awakening, which is the death and rebirth as she is reborn as the May Queen. By placing a made-up book titled The Secret Nazi Language of the Utark on a table in a scene early in the film when the group's discussing their trip, Astor is specifically referencing a supposedly secret, occult, dark interpretation of the runes. But in an interview, Astor claimed that they tailored that language to their own hidden meanings, even though, from our research, the Utark translation written by Dr. Thomas Carlson seems spot on throughout this film. What else? You have a female member of the Harga cult who has reached reproductive age and has been given permission to mate with Christian, because apparently that's how this works, because his astrological sign is a match, is what we're told. Part of this involves her placing a doll under his bed, which is imitation sympathetic magic, and she actually feeds him her pubic hair and menstrual blood, which is contagion sympathetic magic and disgusting, and something the audience is actually once again told is going to happen by the artwork on a tapestry that's displayed well beforehand.
Which itself is more imitative magic. It's telling what they want to happen and bringing it about by portraying it.
That happens over and over in this film. Yeah, see, most scary movies don't do that. They actually wait for psychological tension to build up to scare you. This movie isn't trying to do that at all. It's telling you the whole time exactly what's about to happen. Pretty much, there's really not that much suspense. So they come to Christian and they inform him that he's approved to mate with her, and he doesn't say no. In fact, he pretty much says nothing this entire time. He doesn't stand on principle for pretty much anything throughout the entire film. He is one of the weakest lead male characters in a movie that I've seen in recent memory that I can even think of. I mean, he lies to his friends, he lies to his girlfriend, he seems to think only about himself. All in all, the character named Christian is a huge douchebag. And at one point, Pele actually is alone with Danny and asks if she feels held by Christian, because he goes on to explain that his community supports him and cares for him, and he feels like he has a real family, which is a conversation that comes off as if it's really discussing Christianity's failures rather than Christian, the person, the boyfriend. During the mating ritual, which happens in a womb-shaped building, it isn't just Christian and this girl, but a group of women from the cult are all standing around in a semicircle, and they all mimic the noises that the girl makes while this is going on, which just made everyone in the theater incredibly uncomfortable. People, at least in our viewing, were bursting out laughing with the discomfort of this scene. And you actually have one elderly woman in the group get behind the couple and push on Christian's butt while they're having sex. And I read an interview, and Astor claimed this scene was something he totally made up for the film, but as it turns out, even this is incredibly similar to Tahitian mating rituals, which would take place in front of the entire village and involve the elderly women of the tribe instructing the couple while they mated in front of everybody. So even there, you have something being shown that's based on real sex magic rituals that have taken place in other cultures.
Yeah, and more than that, it's really about not this girl getting pregnant and having a baby, but the whole community having a baby and then bringing about life in general. And it's like a weird hive mind.
Yeah, it's like one collective consciousness unit, this community. It's not just your average society, at least not anything that any of us are used to thinking of. When Danny peeks in on what Christian is doing, which they don't really keep her from doing that, they pretty much want her to see it, it's basically the last straw in her ability to hold her feelings back, and she breaks down into these heart-wrenching sobs and screams. But you have the Hargett girls immediately right there on the floor with her, screaming and crying and breathing along with her, taking on her emotions all as one big hive unit. And in this way, they're like a hive mind. And through joining with it, Danny is finally able to allow herself to feel and work through her emotions that she's been trying to fight and hold back this entire film. In certain mystery rites, including the Eleusinian mysteries, which were actually derived from the rites of Isis in Egypt, uninitiated outsiders who happened upon the ceremonies and the rites were swiftly put to death, which is also what happens in this film. Of all the outsiders that come into the Hargett, only Danny, who becomes fully initiated, survives the process. At the end, you have 9 people who get burned to death in a pyramid-shaped temple. One member of the Hargett gets chosen by lottery as a possible sacrifice, but as May Queen, Danny gets to choose the last person to die. Not surprisingly, she chooses Christian, who's sucked this entire film. The audience was actually tipped off that this would happen very early on, however, when they first arrive, because Christian gets kicked by a member of the cult as they're dancing around, and someone mentions designating a fool. And ceremonial fools are often chosen to be targets of ritualistic sacrifice. So Danny chooses Christian, and they dress him up in a freshly killed bear's skin and put him in the middle of this temple, and a man comes up to him and says, "With you, we purge our most unholy effects." which means emotions, and we banish you now to the deepest recesses where you may reflect on your wickedness. So what you're seeing there is a classic scapegoat ritual setup wherein the group is purified through a transference of negative thoughts and feelings onto someone else who then gets sacrificed. And I guess the message we're supposed to take away from that is, well, it sure beats psychotropic medication, right? I mean, I also want to just note that in indigenous North American and North Eurasian societies, the bear has long been considered the archetypal messenger to the supernatural world. So even the choice of a bear here, though barely discussed in the film at all, you see this bear randomly in the background throughout the movie, it makes sense. And it harkens back to the beginning of the film when in Danny's room you see her laying in bed and above her bed is a picture of Goldilocks facing down a bear. I mean, that's exactly what happens at the end of the movie. So once again, they're depicting in art what's going to happen later on in the film. Nothing in this film ends up actually being a surprise if you pay attention at all.
What's that?
We started analyzing the plot and the character names and the definitions of words, and there's a totally submerged, not obvious on the surface, symbolic language throughout this film, and it absolutely plays out and makes sense in a logical fashion. And it's basically about a declining, suffocating society that literally cannot breathe, that the main character Danny Arter comes from, who comes back alive and has an illumination in a society that is flourishing and vibrant and alive with the spirit. And the breathing process is a metaphor for keeping the spirit or the breath of society alive, and the related terms of inspiring, expiring, conspiring, yes, the conspiracy of literally breathing together, of respiring, perspiring, aspiring, and etc., other parts of the words. All of these are aspects of the necessary process to keeping the spirit alive and healthy in the organism as well as in the individual. And with this spirit, because the spire, this inspiring, expiring, conspiring, this is all breath, this is all spirit in terms of the dictionary definition and the philosophical and symbolic underpinnings of this. The spirit is the breath, and by dictionary definition, it relates not only to the soul, but to breath as the life gift of the deity. The whole story is wrapped up in the symbolic meanings of the names and the literal definitions of key symbolic actions that take place during this film, especially breathing. The quest of Danny Arter, whose family died from asphyxiation, whose name, Danny, means God is my judge, and Arter, which means passionate, heatedly, as of the sun's rays, is to find the fire of life that just isn't sparking anymore in the typical Western society setting. Her sister, who commits suicide and takes her family down with her by suffocating and asphyxiating on too much carbon dioxide, her name is Terry, which comes from Teresa and means the harvest. And she harvests herself and the family, and it's an inverted, false, meaningless harvest that doesn't lead to renewal, that just furthers death. Her boyfriend, Christian Hughes, whose name literally embodies the dominant religious order of this society, combined with a name which in Old German relates to, quote, heart and mind, and which in Old Britain and Welsh cultures meant, quote, fire or inspiration, is thoroughly uninspiring. He is non-committal, not only about the weakening flame of their romantic relationship, but about the course in his life, his college studies, everything, and even in basic communications, where he's both contradictory and evasive, not only with his girlfriend, but with his buds as well. He can't give a straight answer about anything. He doesn't know what he wants to do with himself, and he's pretty much uninspiring and weak and dull. And that's from a guy whose name means fire and inspiration in the hearts and minds. If you start the film by analyzing Christian Hughes after he forgets Danny Arter's birthday, you see him impotently trying to make up for the lost effort by lighting a birthday cake candle that just won't light. It can't even spark. While behind him, the interconnected community that the viewer is only just beginning to become suspicious of is celebrating the birth of new life, singing to the baby and syncing with it in comparatively perfect harmony, when he literally can't get the spark of life going, and that's the meaning of his namesake and the failures represented by his character. Of course, this is just one of the final straws in a legacy of lukewarm behaviors on the part both of Christian Hughes, the boyfriend character, traveling to Sweden with his grad student friends and with the girlfriend he treats as unwanted baggage, but it's also symbolically the attitude that transfers to the dominant religion, the dominant social myths of our time. A paradigm that draws both from socio-political economic spheres, but which especially hints at the rotting spiritual core of this country and this Western society. And it's a critique, basically, of how it's becoming ineffective, hollow, and about as weak as Rome was after the rise of Christianity and the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire, somewhere between 4 and 500 AD. So this becomes sort of an esoteric film analysis, picking apart words and looking for hidden clues in a film that overtly teases us with occult symbols and strange rituals. I mean, they put runes directly in our face in this movie, and the meanings that go with those runes, many of which are occultic meanings, give the film a whole new depth and new layers of meaning behind it, and encourage us to dig into the rest of the text and into the English words that we can read and analyze to find deeper and deeper meanings in this film. The concept is relatively simple, but it has huge implications which generally go unnoticed. The film and what is happening in society at large as we're living it requires a bit more analysis and decoding to strip away and find the meaning and to reveal the ritual taking place and to reveal the significance of those rituals. The unabridged Webster's Dictionary of 1894, which combines the 1864, the 1879, and 1884 issues of the dictionary, defines fire from the Greek and Latin for pure as, quote, the evolution of light and heat in the combustion of bodies. Combustion, a state of ignition, end quote. Midsommar deals with a belief system adapted from ancient pagan rituals that regards the purifying sacrificial fire as a, quote, state of ignition for their society's continuity, for its growth and its renewal. Let's break down this formula. The ignition of society's transformation, the catalyst, is carried out through combustion, through a fire, an evolutionary process that combines light and heat as bodies combust, as the solids are transformed by the flaming gases. There's an entire chemical process here, and it works alchemically, it works metaphorically and symbolically, and it works at least to a certain degree in science and the actual dictionary definition of what's going on with fire. Fire very much represents something hugely symbolic with the story of Midsommar, with the ritual that you see them carry out that has been carried out in countless societies for a time that is immeasurable. And these include aspects of the sun, the literal solar body that hovers above the planet and gives fuel and heat and light to the life processes. And it also represents aspects of the solar deity that's symbolized by the sun that has been deified and worshipped by many old belief systems throughout time. The light and heat of the sun are symbolized in man by the torch, the flame that mankind must carry and not let burn out. The system of great attainment and development that has yielded much knowledge, technology, and progress. This aspect is symbolized significantly by the Greek titan Prometheus and the biblical figure Lucifer, the devil. It was Prometheus who stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, representing knowledge and technology, and who paid an eternal price for his transgression. It was Lucifer, the morning star, who tempted Adam and Eve with the pride of believing they could become immortal gods by breaking the taboo of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and through the bearing of light came the fall of Adam and Eve through their transgression. So with this flame, with this torch that has so much symbolic meaning, the knowledge itself must be brought to life, quote, in burning combustion with the heat of the sun as well As they stated in the movie, the flame of the 72-year-old members who are at the end of the life cycle, who've lived the 4th season, they state directly that their flames, their fires, will go no higher, no hotter. So it's the symbolic end of the flame. It has a lot of energy, a lot of heat, a lot of light, but that's the height of it, and thus the end of their life. But this light, the symbolic light of knowledge itself, has to be brought to life in burning combustion by the very definition of fire, with the heat of the sun as well. That's the heart, the passion, and the spirit that's imbued with the breath of life with oxygen. And this is represented symbolically by the main character, the protagonist, Danny Arter, whose name means passion, like the heat from the sun's rays. By the end of the film, our protagonist, Danny Arter, who starts out as basically an emotional wreck, she has a lot of anxiety. She's dealing especially with the tragic death of her parents and her sister by asphyxiation, a literal lack of oxygen to the bloodstream in the brain. She eventually reaches illumination and a type of apotheosis as she becomes the May Queen through the transformational illumination process represented and depicted in the film. Danny finds a new source of spirit, of breath, of knowledge, the light of the sun that is to meet her passion, her own heat. Back at home in America and Western society, her heat was turning freezing cold in the dead of winter. At the beginning of the film, it's the dead of winter, and her family dies, they expire, they don't have oxygen, they asphyxiate. And Danny, who's very emotional and represented by the heat of the fire, is without sufficient comfort and without necessary support because all she has is the lukewarm arms of her boyfriend, Christian Hughes. And the supposed fire and inspiration that he represents is lackluster at best in the context of the film. And as the film progresses, once Danny recognizes the potential for emotional support and that all-important sense of, quote, being held and being cared for, she finds this new pathway within this cult and begins to realize for the first time that the spirit of her life could be reignited, and only later does she realize this is to be done literally with the ritual of fire, with the burning and renewal of her life and the life of the greater community. The process of oxygenating the blood of the organism, of keeping things fresh and healthy and vital, happens through respiration, a breathing process, inhaling and exhaling of air, respiration, and in other word meanings of, quote, inspiring new initiates and iterations of the group, also through the definition of expiring, of breathing out old members who've reached their peak, who've lived their life, who are at the end of their cycle in life, and who must expire and be breathed out in order to keep the process going. That's kind of the balance and connection with nature that this cult community in Sweden keeps representing throughout the film. And you'll notice at key moments, they take breaths often together at certain symbolic moments in the ritual. The character of Danny takes several key breaths. Earlier in the film, she's unable to breathe. She has a hard time letting herself become emotional, even though she feels that way. She's even taking a prescription medication that stifles her ability to breathe, and that in trying to deal with her anxiety actually lessens her ability to breathe. Very symbolic in the movie. You see a group of people who are, on the one hand, plotting to dupe people into becoming human sacrifices, literally conspiring together, that are also literally conspiring together by breathing together. They take on the spirit of the community as a group. They physically, literally mirror each other's emotions, breathe at the same time, and kind of get in sync with one another. And this all fits into the definition of spirit itself as a breath. And they really take it all in together in this attitude of balance and being in touch with nature, which also breathes. There's a lot of scenes where they're hallucinating with mushrooms and special tea brews. And both Danny and Christian witness nature breathing and sort of pulsating in and out. You see it in the flowers and the trees and different aspects of nature. So breathing is very much part of this movie. Because I think a lot of people who watched this film in theaters, who just watched it on the surface, saw a lot of the surprises coming and the deaths coming and kind of found it to be predictable. But there's a lot that they're not seeing there because they're not watching it with a symbolic analysis attached to it. Because when you watch it in that way, it's very meaningful and it becomes a really creepy narrative about where society actually is going in the real world. So this esoteric film analysis of a film that overtly teases us with occult symbols and strange rituals ultimately argues that a controlling establishment, an elite priest class, must produce a sort of combustion engine with which to run society. And this is a combustion engine that requires a great deal of oxygen and spirit. And by dictionary definition, it fuses the light of knowledge, of information, whatever is revealed, whatever is concealed, with the passions, with the hearts and minds of the people. There's a combination of the types of spirit that have to happen to reach the higher levels here. And so I think the filmmakers here are subtly heralding the end of an age, the age that we live in, and the rise of something that is both new and entirely ancient that's taking its place. If Christian Hughes represents a figure that has lost its passion, then he also represents a system that has lost its claim to the king-making role of placing fire and inspiration in the hearts and minds of the masses. It's like an encapsulation of the Vietnam mantra that the American mission there was to capture the hearts and minds, and that's how they were going to win the war. That's pretty much the idea here on a mass scale, and the idea is that it's failing. The all-important formula here for statecraft and for mankind craft, for the engineering of societies that has been employed over centuries and millennia, and likely for ages before that, requires a system that is a beneficiary of the illumination process. People in society have to progress to a certain point of thinking, and that mode of thinking has to benefit the status quo, the system that is to take power or that is in power.
Yeah, so the message that they're trying to present here is, look how screwed up Western society is. Here's what we could replace it with. It would actually be better. It's actually a double-handed promotion of these kinds of concepts and a bringing back or a hearkening back to a time that they're promoting as being more harmoniously balanced, environmentally balanced, which is essentially not new. It's old. It's just like Madame Helena Blavatsky said, the Theosophist, when she said that the religion of the future is the religion of the ancients. I mean, that's what it seems like is being brought in, and whatever they're bringing in next is coming right now with all of this new technology they're bringing in and the push for transhumanism and singularity that we're seeing. This is what's actually going on, and they are really pushing a eugenic society. Population control is being pushed all the time, and all kinds of things that are going on in this film are actually being pushed in our society.
Well, it's a eugenic society because they control the breeding, they control the actual bloodlines, and very carefully pair up members of the community. Part of the whole plot line of bringing in the outsiders for the sacrifice was that their sacrifice was twofold. Their blood was shed in the human sacrifice where they were burned up, but their blood was also contributed in the fertility line and the reproduction by bringing in outside blood so it didn't become too genetically narrow. That's one of the areas where we see esoteric philosophy and exoteric. They have an outside story they tell all the members and other people, and then there's an inside philosophy, a secret doctrine that they practice within. And you see this when Christian, who is supposedly an anthropology student studying their group, he's talking to someone outside about, oh yeah, you bring in outside blood, and it's ironic because he doesn't realize he's going to be one such person. But meanwhile, you've got his more serious counterpart, Josh, inside quizzing.
In a chapel, right? He's like inside of a...
He's inside the temple quizzing one of the chief priests about their practices, and he says, oh, well, actually, unlike the guy outside who told him that they respect the incest taboo and that's why they bring in outsiders to reproduce, the priest inside says they deliberately inbreed and don't follow the incest taboo so they can produce children who, in their terms, are unclouded. They're not messed up, they're unclouded, and therefore they can channel spirits, they can channel the entities that actually guide and direct their society. But it's kind of a farce because it's basically this unclouded oracle. He doesn't have normal cognition, and he just kind of finger paints messily all over these papers, and then the priest interpret what that's supposed to mean and what that's supposed to mean that the gods want them to do, and then they just write their own books about it, just like really any other priest class throughout history. The sacrifices of human blood from both within and without the collective organism cult that appears in Midsommar, the people from within the cult and the people who are brought in from America and from the UK, are key features in a fertility ritual where the, quote, burning away of the old, of the flawed, of the sinful parts of man are done away with. They're scapegoated and through the fire purified, allowing a new man, a new type of humanity to emerge with the new year, with the new crop growing up in its place, and it's fertilized by the ashes of the dead and of the older generations, and theoretically uplifted by the lessons learned, etc. And this is a movie that is self-referential of that method, and it reveals and strips to the core the rituals that are being used for that purpose, and kind of draws the audience's own participation into it, while they tell a story basically about, lost Western Americans who are kind of typical douchebags in a postmodern declining society who find either their demise or their renewal in a Swedish cult that's practicing ancient time-held traditions that are really creepy, that trivialize individual lives. This ritual is an alchemical process, and it happens in the story and in the movie too. And basically, it ends up being a confrontation of ideas. It's a dialectic that gets the person in one state to confront the problem or the transformative idea, and by basically clashing with that idea, there's some kind of synthesis afterwards, right? So why would they put rituals in movies? Well, it's to alchemically or magically confront people with certain ideas that in some way or manner transform society, right? They get them to where they want to go. Even though you pretty much know what's going to happen in this movie, I think the way it plays out is very thought-provoking and ultimately very creepy and eerie for the reality that we're living through.
Because he literally refuses to look at all the signs that are being literally handed to him the entire play.
But that's the thing, it isn't just the artwork. I mean, the architecture, the use of runes, the costumes. They even created what he calls an effect language, an emotional language akin to singing in tongues. It was created specially for this film. I mean, they went to a level and took it to a level that I don't think your average movie takes it to try and get these ideas across. So the entire movie is just completely drenched in this symbolic language.
And the whole time they've got a secret language going with the runes.
I mean, at one point, one of the people is killed and cut up and buried, and on the bottom of the person's foot is a rune that literally is inverted, and when I looked it up, it meant something like, you have no hope, there's no hope left for you, like you're done. So every single rune that is shown on screen the whole time to the audience is actually communicating something, either about the character, the building, or the scene itself, or what's happening. And you're told right away at the beginning that you're going to be communicated with in this secret language. I mean, this is what this movie's like. There are multiple layers of meaning happening in every single scene the entire time. It's communicating to everyone in this Twilight language that you'd have to, I mean, I'm sure we missed a lot. And this is all the stuff that we noticed. And I'm sure we missed a lot. That's how oddly specific and deep this movie goes.
Sometimes the tradition keeps itself regenerating. People go through the motions because generations before them did it. Unconscious group work was taking place with larger symbolic meanings and deeply transformative effects on the members of its congregation going on, but in the background, unconsciously. And there's something quite insidious buried into the structure of it all, in that what's really happening is reflected in the portrait that Midsommar so plainly puts into view. It's a mind that is ready to change. The pathway of initiation into something that has been carefully prepared and ritualistically consecrated. That's what we're talking about. It's structured on something very old and now fairly well documented. That's where the James Fraser Golden Bough stuff comes in. From Burning Man to Wicker Man and the burning Christian bear in the temple in Midsommar, this has all been patterned after deeply held beliefs and traditions. These are rituals that have been documented and studied around the world anthropologically. Midsommar draws from the same deep wellspring of superstitious rites that other pagan cultures throughout history have. And so these are part of an ancient esoteric philosophy in his seminal book, many ancient pagan cult practices that have appeared throughout time around the world. And although there are minor variations in details and practice, this movie puts on display again and again familiar forms of sacrifice that have been practiced the world over, largely in an attempt to control nature by appealing to a deity for favor. Like other reiterations of ancient beliefs, practices include or revolve around A. fertility ceremonies, phallic symbolism, regeneration rituals surrounding death and rebirth. This is first and foremost to ensure good crops and reproduction, but also other forms of abundance and development and the like. This spirit of vegetation has been recognizably deified in antiquity as Dionysus, Bacchus, Osiris, and Adonis, among other gods who mythologically die off at the end of each growing season and symbolically regenerate in the spring. The film, as well as ancient rituals, include sacraments focused on crops and continuity abound, as do totems of nature and the natural world. B. The use of scapegoats. This includes both living vessels like animals and humans, as well as effigies, representational vessels that are used to cast off sin, darkness, bad spirits, and they either purify it through fires or exile it into the wilderness. Bohemian Grove is a classic example as well.
To sum it up quickly, basically all of our nation's supposed leaders get together in a highly guarded boys-only club once a year and spend 2 weeks in the woods doing mock rituals, which appear to include a boat from the river Styx, which is taken down a river to a giant owl statue they call Moloch, where they stand around in hooded robes and burn an effigy to cremate their care.
C. The mourning and celebration for the, quote, death of vegetation gods and solar deities at large, whose personification in the life cycle of the seasons and the harvest of food and reproduction of life carries a heavy symbolic weight. As demonstrated at Midsommar, key festivals and ceremonies often revolve around these themes at changing of the seasons, solstices, periods of celestial alignment, and the beginning and end of new years of planting seasons, etc. D. In Midsommar, nature is breathing and pulsating with life, particularly during the frequent hallucinations that are induced by magic mushrooms and other special brews and concoctions. And although they don't focus on it, this reflects in part the traditional role of magic flowers, herbs, and mushrooms, the gathering of which has been customarily tied very closely to Midsummer's Eve, when the special attributes and magical qualities of these various flora are believed to be at their height. So that's kind of subtly expressed in the movie. E. The use of fire to drive away evil spirits and generally to purify and protect are very well noted in the history of these rituals. Early on in the film Midsommar, you see the lady who's sort of the MC of the ceremonies clap her hand together and say, "Out bad spirits." She talks about sending out and sending away the evil spirits. That's something that appears in these festivals, again, that are around the world, they're across time. They're in places that didn't communicate with each other or seem to have contact, and yet they have eerily similar elements in all of their practices. A classic example is the Beltane fires of Scotland, which typically take place on or around May Day, but are sometimes also celebrated at Midsummer. And they're ultimately derived from old Baal worship of the sun and of fertility rites, which is warned about in the Old Testament because they were passing children and people and other living things through the fire to offer them up to this pagan deity. The fire festivals in general are almost always periodic and match the symbolic times of year, especially at Midsummer. And most vividly and horrifically, Midsommar does not skimp on the burning of human beings in fires, which again, Sir James Frazer does cover in his book, in which he makes a case that there was very credibly human being sacrifice throughout time, and that a lot of the festivals that continue today and that were keenly observed in the last couple centuries no longer overtly sacrifice human beings, but the nature of their rituals imply and signify that they used to. I guess humanity kind of realized it was a little bit in poor taste, and we didn't have to be quite so savage. But mankind has come out of a very savage tradition where they did sacrifice human beings, and chances are it probably really does still go on, even today in the 21st century in certain pockets around the planet. But again, this movie kind of turns the world upside down, because as twisted as this cult is, our broader Western society really doesn't have a problem with sacrificing human life and letting people die and go neglected. You know, we have a very sick society as well. Not that any of this is right or should be emulated, because it's quite dark as well, but kind of puts it in contrast. Anyway, Frazer details especially the ancient Celtic practices of human sacrifice. It took place in a number of cultures around the world, but there's very clear evidence, and the stories about the Wicker Man are, according to historians and anthropologists, true and based on true accounts. Caesar describes seeing the giant 40-foot wicker effigies that human beings, most of them were prisoners, some of them were captured in war, were put in there amongst the foliage and the woven branches, along with livestock and animals. It's exactly what's portrayed in the Wicker Man, and this movie pretty much mirrors that as well, but it takes on different trappings, being located in Sweden, but not being really substantially different from other human sacrifice cult practices. And of course, it puts Burning Man in relief as well, even though there's no deliberate loss of life or anything like that. And another thing that is replete in the rituals of humanity throughout time that is covered extensively in the Golden Bough is the sacrifice of the old, of the outsider, of the symbolic transgressor. All of these are familiar aspects. So too is the anointing of a May Queen to oversee and encourage maximum fertility and growth. And this basically represents a deity embodied on earth just for a temporary time. The maypole is a tree that's cut down and decorated annually with flowers or else permanently erected in village centers, and generally evokes the power of the tree spirit and is meant to, quote, bring in the fructifying spirit of vegetation newly awakened in spring. But for Scandinavia and for northern parts of Europe, this is a vitality that's also still very key at midsummer. And of course, they have such a long winter. You've got the appearance of sex magic and ritualistic reproduction. There's a lot of variations on that, but that's a major element. There's the selecting of sacrifices amongst undesirables, but also, again, the anointing of a king for a day, or of the volunteering of an actual king who acknowledges his duty to take on the necessary sacrifice in atonement for bad years, for failed crops, for poor rain, and for the collective sins of society as it stands. And the movie Wicker Man and a much less known cult movie, The Eye of the Devil, both demonstrate this, the sacrifice of the king figure or of the Lord figure in a very pronounced way. So overall, imitative magic, contagion magic, and sympathetic rituals of all kinds are used to great effect in Midsommar, and it also draws heavily, of course, as Melissa explains, from occult rune magic, this being the Uttark tradition and just more broadly from Norse mythology. So this movie came about in 2019 in a society where corruption abounds, and it's clear that a purification and a renewal process of some kind is appropriate, but the question that is raised through seeing this film and through watching other signposts of culture is who and what deity, what belief system, what priest class is going to be in charge of overseeing the purification and renewal of society? Where are they taking us, and who gets to make the decisions here? Because again, the symbolic analysis does not look good for the individual. The individual who has a healthy body, makes his own decisions, who has a great sense of purpose, who is illuminated as an individual, doesn't have much of a place in a society that's becoming highly technological and collective and groupthink oriented. Author Aaron Franz writes in his 2012 book, Revolve, Man's Scientific Rise to Godhood, in his chapter on alchemy through the ages, that the alchemists are now preparing for a grand ritual that will initiate the entire human race into the final golden phase of the great work. The base metals, man, will finally be turned into gold, the new man. The new man is a wonderful spiritual being, but he is also the product of science. He transcends human limitations to become completely post-human. Before time ends, it speeds up to an extreme degree. Degree are units that measure heat. When the parts of any system speed up, they get hot. Solid substances have slow-moving particles, but as the particles heat up and go faster, the solid transforms into liquid, and then to gas. Gases rise because it has the fastest-moving particles. This is a scientific property of matter. The various parts of an internal combustion engine get incredibly hot when they are in motion, and thus the need for motor oil and coolant to keep them from melting. Alchemy is a science, an occult science that has these same properties, although they are for the most part symbolic. It uses heat to melt metals and subsequently purify them through transmutation to higher degrees of purity. This is the nature of heat and of fire. The fire of creation burns things up, supposedly towards heaven. Mystic fire, that element brought to man by Prometheus, is finally used to its fullest extent as it burns the body of man at the altar. This is done to initiate his new higher level of consciousness, to become reborn, born of fire like the phoenix. Man must go through this trial by fire. The old man must burn so the new man may rise. This symbolism is ancient, but you may just recognize it from the Burning Man festival that takes place every year in the Nevada desert. Symbolically speaking, it is the sunlight that actually energizes life on our planet. It's fire that speeds up dead matter and animates it to the status of life. Man's existence is secondary to that of the sun, and is also seen as an extension of the sun's very essence. Living light is man.
So you basically have three major rituals that are portrayed throughout this film, and the thing about these rituals is the techniques that Astor used while filming this movie ensure that the audience will feel like they also are participating in the actual festival and in these rituals, not just watching it as an audience member, but actually participating in it.
These rituals, these festivals are a form of atonement that represent past sins collectively acknowledged, and they represent symbolically a renewal and a transformation that looks very much towards the future.
Society is changing, it's transforming. The old society is dying and being done away with to make room for the new society that we're moving into. And that's the overarching message in this film. Like I said, it's not just a scary film. It's not just your average scary movie. There's something larger that's being communicated here, and it's being communicated on multiple different levels, and they make sure that you as an audience member are participating. The Hollywood machine that spends billions of dollars promoting and pushing information onto the masses obviously wants society to not only be introduced to these concepts, but to accept them and receive an education in them. The films themselves are actually initiations. The classic initiation, as pointed out by Dr. Thomas Carlson, involves a symbolic death, descent into the underworld, a rebirth, and return. The initiate's old life and self, presented as a cage of ignorance, dies, and he or she is enlightened or illuminated and reborn into a new life. Through this process of initiation, the adept receives esoteric knowledge about a religion or myth's hidden truths.
And various sacrifices and rituals take place at this Midsommar festival, but the arc of the story really isn't with those rituals that are carried out. They're already set in motion, they're taking place as planned, and the community, the cult there, has already adjusted to that. It's a way to purge and purify their community. The arc of the whole film is really how are these outsider Western American characters going to adapt to the rituals, and we're set up to see Danny fail, but she actually comes to see the light of the whole thing, and it becomes the guys who can't adjust to it and who are eaten up and devoured by it and become their sacrifices.
At the end, what you really are seeing is that Danny chooses Christian. He gets put in a giant bear suit and stuck in there with the other sacrifices. They light the whole place on fire, and so she ends up basically killing someone as her final act of becoming fully initiated into this cult. Just before Christian is chosen to die, the audience is made to once again see first person through his eyes. They open his eyes like the eyes are the camera. And at the end, the audience watches this temple burn through Danny's eyes. So in this way, the audience, who has been made to feel present in the film in an almost augmented virtual reality kind of way, they're also getting sacrificed and being reborn through watching this movie. This is the level. And so by her final act of choosing Christian for ritual sacrifice, you have Danny fully initiated into the Hargett. And in the final moments of this film, as the group begins writhing around and screaming as if they're all demon-possessed while this temple burns down, Danny is shown finally liberated from her pain and suffering and her crappy boyfriend, and she's illuminated. And to make sure that this message hits home of Danny's liberation and illumination, one of the final scenes of this movie shows this burning pyramid slowly fading out as it falls over one of Danny's eyes, and her eye is aligned with the top of this pyramid, just like an all-seeing eye symbol right there on screen. That is how blatant this movie is. And then a smile slowly creeps across Danny's face while this temple burns down and the credits roll. So she's fully illuminated, and so basically what you end up with is this choice of whether or not you're going to be assimilated and transitioned and illuminated and initiated like Danny, or are you going to be hanging on to the old system like Christian and sacrificed and done away with. I mean, that's basically how they leave it, since you as an audience member participate. Again, like I said, they make you seem like you're a participant. When you watch this, it's just like at Burning Man, they say it's no spectators. Isn't that what they say about Burning Man? Same thing here. That's what they make this movie, so that it's like everyone is participating and you're left with a choice at the end. Everyone else who didn't assimilate, they all get killed. In interviews, Astor has called this a breakup movie, but it actually comes across as a breakup of modern society with Christianity, in the personage of Christian, who's portrayed as practically worthless. And in that, it is much like the original 1973 film The Wicker Man, in which the main protagonist character is also a Christian who gets sacrificially burned to death at the end in a scapegoat ritual by yet another pagan cult, in a film timed perfectly with the counterculture movement that was actually going on at the time, much like what I think is going on today, a counterculture movement 2.0. So here you have the hive mind collective consciousness of this Harga, ultimately portrayed as liberating for Dani, and a supporting family unit that, albeit in a completely twisted way, enables her to heal from the traumas that the lifestyle of the horrible Western world has inflicted upon her. She's liberated and illuminated. It calls to mind the pantheistic secret society universal brotherhood concept that has been promoted everywhere, from the Luciferian theosophists of the 1800s to the Freemasons to the United Nations. And speaking of, the Harga's ways are also depicted as environmentally friendly and harmoniously in balance with nature, despite the fact that it's a murderous eugenical pagan cult whose harmonious balance is only achieved through practicing incest, ritual sacrifice, and synticide, along with the rest of it. What you have displayed here is nearly 2.5 hours of what Arnold Toynbee has referred to as the fanatical worship of collective human power, with an environmentalism twist. And no one talks about what the New Age, Burning Man, Agenda 21, Gaia-worshipping, monistic global society of the future might look like if it's taken all the way out to its logical conclusion, but we've already seen many aspects of the Harga in this movie promoted in our own society. And as we've previously reported, paganism isn't just making a comeback, it's actually being promoted across all aspects of pop culture and the mainstream media as an inviting lifestyle choice now, providing an answer to the spiritual void that's been created over the last 160 years since the secret society promoted Darwinian theory of evolution was pushed to now dogma status. The idea that we're overpopulated and we're at fault for climate change and destruction to the environment is only something we've been hearing about for decades now and pretty much every day if you're somebody who goes on Twitter or Facebook. While on one side you have the Silicon Valley elite that Elon Musk has said is Burning Man, attempting to secure immortality through technology on one end of the spectrum, we have Rahm Emanuel's brother, bioethicist Ezekiel, who was special advisor for health policy in the Obama administration while Obamacare was being written, actually promoting the idea in The Atlantic that we have no reason to live past the age of 75, so we might as well just kill ourselves then. We might as well just die at 75.
What happens about growing old? And the article is a very personal article to think about what's the meaning and purpose of your life. And I picked 75 when you think about the combination of physical decline, the rise of Alzheimer's, the loss of creativity.
So I guess we get just 3 more years than the Harga would allow. In many ways, you have a death cult that has a lot of the hallmarks of a potential future society. And I was actually surprised to find this admitted in a review of this movie. In Tribune magazine, you had a write-up by author Mazen Salim who actually asked, what if a hotter planet will be a boon for something like the Harga, a taste of cultures to come? And then described a potential rise of cults that teach a Kish ecology of harmonious life cycles to justify murder for population management, pointing out that in Peter Frase's book, Four Futures, he actually predicts exterminism practiced by exclusivist elite communes as one of the potential futures society could face in the age of climate change. So while this is a movie on the screen on one hand, some aspects of this are being discussed as a potential future for society. I mean, it's pretty insane. Like I said, this isn't just a random horror film. In fact, these ideas aren't random at all. They're actually being injected into society at large at a key pivotal time. And as authors Michael Hoffman and Dave McGowan and Jay Dyer in his Esoteric Hollywood series and others have extensively documented, Hollywood with the Pentagon and CIA in tow have long been into creating counterculture movements and steering toxic culture creation in general. And so, after what we saw last year, it's really not a surprise at all that a movie like Midsommar is coming out at the same time that pagan religions and ancient pantheistic religious practices are enjoying this huge resurgence in our postmodern society to kick the can that much farther down the road with this. This is predictive programming wrapped up in a full-on occult ritual primer. And it wasn't even Ari Aster's idea to make this movie originally. He was approached by a company called Be Real that commissioned him to make a scary movie about Midsummer festivals.
And just like in The Wicker Man and other iterations of this, we see that the Burning Man, whether it's a literal human sacrifice or just an effigy, is again this purification, this scapegoat sacrifice, and the ashes of that are a phoenix for the society. It's all about a regeneration process, and the fact that Christian is put into a bear, many of the ancient legends say that the bear represents ancient man himself, and obviously the animalistic side of man, the lower parts of him, the appetites and the sinfulness, the focus on just animalistic fertility, the inability to see or operate in the higher degrees of consciousness. That's part of what they want to burn away, because they want to free the soul and unite with basically what has always been throughout history in all these ancient fertility cults, an attempt to unify with the solar deity, with the energy of the sun. To create the fire, you need a mix of the light and the heat. This burning process combines heat and light, and that's exactly what happens in Danny Arter. Once you realize she becomes illuminated at the end and is not only comfortable with this society, but is set free by this Burning Man ritual process, she's actually regenerated. And this is all, of course, happening at Midsommar, when the sun is literally at its hottest and the day is at its longest in the year in Sweden, when it's very important. The long midnight sun, long bright day versus the very short, very dark, cold, brutal winter. It's a very symbolic time for Danny Arter to become enlightened. And that's sort of the wrap-up hidden message in Midsommar.
Diminished? I don't know. I wasn't sure. He was a splendid match, actually.